Now we're going to start chapter 18, which is one of the longest chapters in the book. There's 5 sections to it, so we'll get started on that. We're going to discuss the power of the popes, analyze the Holy Roman Empire, and evaluate the power struggle between the kings and the popes. So we're dealing still with medieval Europe in this chapter. We're going to discuss kind of the political and religious struggle between the popes and the kings. In the early Middle Ages, nobles and knights had power in Europe, but as time passed, the kings and popes gained more power. So what happens, if you remember from chapter 17, we talked about feudalism and about how the knights and the lords and all these different nobles and stuff gained a lot of power because really they were protecting their own realm. But as time goes on, the kings and the pope gained more power. The pope at the time was the leader of the Christian church in Western Europe, and since most of the citizens belonged to the Christian church, he gave the pope a lot of authority. The question is how much authority and how do they relate to the king? The people looked to the pope for guidance about how to live and pray. The pope was the representative of God in the eyes of the people and would decide what the church would teach. This gave the pope a lot of authority because he was literally the representation of God. It was representing God. And so the people, which were a very religious people, looked to the pope as someone very, very important. If the pope thought that someone was working against the church, they could be excommunicated, which means cast out of the church. And so if someone is going against the teachings of the church, they can be removed from the church. And I'm not talking about making them leave the building. I'm talking about removing them from the assembly of the church, the people of the church. Making them not Christian, basically. Losing their salvation, whatever you want to call it. They will be removed from the Christian church. Many times the pope was seen as the political leader of the people as well, and this will bring popes into direct conflict with the king. In the 1000s, Europe was divided up into small states, but which most of the time were led by kings. Places like England and France had a king that would inherit the throne from their father. It was a hereditary thing. When you had an heir, your firstborn heir would become king. Monarchies have always been that way. The kings would have nobles try to rebel, but most of the time they were able to gain control back. Sometimes nobles would rebel for 20, 30 years and be in rebellion, then the king would take over again. In the Holy Roman Empire, the situation was different because their emperors were chosen by the nobles and not an inheritance from their fathers. And this was a sin in the revival of the Roman Empire, and since the Pope approved it, it was called the Holy Roman Empire. It became the revival of the Roman Empire, where it wasn't something that you necessarily inherited from your father as much as it was the people that was chosen to be the Roman Emperor. This way of attaining power often led to conflict. There was also an issue for power in the church, where the people of Western Europe considered the Pope the head of the church, and the people of Eastern Europe disagreed. The people of Eastern Europe said the Pope's not the head of the church. People in Western Europe said yes, he is. In the eastern part, the bishops made decisions without much guidance from the Pope. They just saw it as basically they were freelance. The bishops could make decisions if they wanted. In the mid-1000s, popes came to power. They believed that all of Europe needed to answer to the Pope. So when the popes came to power in the mid-1000s, they believed that all of Europe needed to listen to them. Pope Leo IX was one of these popes that believed that the Pope was supposed to be leader of the entire church. And because of this, he faced opposition, especially from the Bishop of Constantinople, who wouldn't recognize his authority and would eventually be excommunicated or cast out of the church. He literally cast the Bishop of Constantinople out of the church, excommunicated him because of his opposition. Leo's decision to excommunicate the bishop led to a split in the church, forming what would become the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholics. Now, remember we talked before, especially last year, about the 3 divisions of the Christian church. You have the Greek Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, or the Catholic Church today, and the Protestant Church. This is where the first split takes place. Conflict would arise as the kings and popes disagreed over who had authority to choose bishops. Some, such as Henry IV, got mad at Gregory VII for a choice in bishop and for questioning his authority. When the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV was the emperor, that convinced Germany's bishops to remove Gregory as the pope. So what happens is you have Henry IV that comes to power, and he doesn't like that Pope Gregory VII picks a bishop. And so because of this, He talks to the Germany's bishops and tries to have Gregory removed as pope. Because of this, Gregory has Henry IV excommunicated. This is going to lead to a big ordeal. They're going to fight back and forth over this. When Henry IV was excommunicated, he traveled to Italy and stood barefoot in snow for 3 days until Gregory VII forgave him and allowed him back in the church. So literally, the king had to go and stand barefoot in the snow begging for the forgiveness of the Pope because he had been excommunicated. He had lost his authority, basically, because he was removed from the Christian church. This is going to lead, and he did allow him back in the church. After the deaths of Henry IV and Gregory VII, the new Pope and Emperor came to a compromise which would allow church officials to choose bishops, but they would still have to obey the Roman Emperor. So they would allow the popes to choose these bishops, but they still had to follow the emperor. They couldn't just kind of do what they wanted to do. This would help the relationship, but not end all the conflict between popes and emperors. And so you kind of see here the clash you're going to have, and this takes place a number of times in Europe between the pope and the king of, okay, well, if I make you pope, then I have authority over you. If the pope appoints the king, then the pope has authority over the king. And so they're going to have this power struggle that's going to continue on for a very long time.